We've been traveling around the country, as Dennis said, and I really want to thank Dennis because, well, without Dennis, this book wouldn't have been possible, certainly not this tour, although, I don't know, 100 cities. This is about 28, and I was feeling very proud of this. We're at 28 cities until someone said, "You mean you only have 72 to go?" So, you know, we broadcast every day, a daily radio show and TV show. Democracy Now!, well, we originally come from Pacifica Radio, founded more than 60 years ago after World War II. A war resistor named Lou Hill came out of the detention camps and said, "We've got to have a media outlet that is not brought to us by corporations that profit from war, but brought to us by journalists and artists." And that's how Pacifica was born. As George Gerbner, the former dean of the Annenberg School of Communications at the University of Pennsylvania, said, "Not brought to us by corporations that have nothing to tell and everything to sell that are raising our children today." And so the first Pacifica station, KPFA, went on the air in 1949. The second station, 1959, was KPFK. My station in New York, WBAI, 1960. Washington, where we're going to be doing a fundraiser for WPFW tomorrow morning before the Big Green Fest, 1977. 1970, KPFT went on the air in Houston, in the Petro Metro. It went on the air in the spring of 1970, and it's the only radio station in the country whose transmitter was blown up. Yeah, blown up by the Ku Klux Klan. They strapped dynamite to the base of the transmitter, and they blew it to smithereens. And when they got back on their feet and rebuilt their transmitter, you know, I mean, there was this silver lining. They didn't have money for advertising, and so here the Klan managed to blow this new station into the consciousness of the potential listening audience of the people of Houston. When they got back on their feet, and right in the middle of Arlo Guthrie singing Alice's Restaurant, they blew it up again. Now, I don't know if it was the Grand Dragon or the Exalted Cyclops, because I often confuse their titles. But he said it was his proudest act. And I think that's because he understood how dangerous Pacifica is. How dangerous independent media is, because it allows people to speak for themselves. And when you hear someone speaking from their own experience, whether it is a Palestinian child or an Israeli grandmother, whether it is an uncle in Iraq or an aunt in Afghanistan, it breaks down stereotypes and caricatures that fuel the hate groups. I really do believe the media can be the greatest force for peace on earth. Instead, it is wielded as a weapon of war. And that has to be challenged. That has to be changed. You know, going back to World War II, there's this story about the Secretary of War, Henry Stimson. When he was given the bombing list of the possible cities in Japan to drop the first atomic bombs on, he was given Hiroshima and Nagasaki. He had to choose. It didn't have to do with military bases or anything like that. Nagasaki, Hiroshima, Kyoto. And he crossed Kyoto off the list, because he and Mrs. Stimson had visited Kyoto, and they found it to be a beautiful city. They loved the people, the landmarks, the food, and he said, "No, we've been there." If only the people of Hiroshima and Nagasaki had been lucky enough to host the Stimsons. But think about how profound that point is. Because they knew them, they were familiar with them. Now, we're familiar with our families and people in our communities, but the way we learn about the rest of the world most often is through the media. And it has got to be through something other than a corporate lens and a corporate microphone. And it's very important that the rest of the world learn about us through something that is independent, not trying to sell them something. For example, when we talk about war, we shouldn't be brought to you by weapons manufacturers. When we talk about healthcare, we shouldn't be brought to you by big pharma, the drug companies, or the insurance companies. When we talk When we talk about climate change, we shouldn't be brought to you by nuclear companies or oil, gas companies, coal companies. We should be brought to you by listeners and viewers like you who are deeply concerned about the fate of the planet. Which brings us to our title, The Silenced Majority. The reason we call it that is I really do believe that those who are deeply concerned about this planet, concerned about war, and I include in that so many soldiers. And so many talks as I go out around the country, it's soldiers who come up to me. It's not about whether you're for or against war, but someone is expressing the fact that we are still at war, in fact, the longest war in this country's history. But those who are concerned about war, concerned about climate change, concerned about the growing inequality in this country are not a fringe minority, not even a silent majority, but the silenced majority, silenced by the corporate media, which is why we have to take it back. Last night, we were speaking at George Mason University at the, I have to be careful not to say the fall of the book, the fall for the book festival. That's their book festival. Alice Walker had spoken in the afternoon. Can you believe it's the 30th anniversary of The Color Purple? I just find that amazing. But a gentleman came up to me before. He had just recently come from Iraq. He was an officer. He worked with the DIA, Defense Intelligence Agency. And he said, you know that your book is required reading at the agency and at the university, National Intelligence University. I said, you're kidding, which book? And he said, Static. It's really interesting. That's my second book, written with my brother, David Goodmen. Our first book was called The Exception to the Rulers. And the reason we call it that, well, it's the motto of Democracy Now! It should be the motto of all the media, the exception to the rulers. The second is called Static. This is the one that DIA folks have to read. Static. We call it that because in this high-tech digital age with high-definition television and digital radio, still all we ever get is static. That veil of distortions and half-truths and lies that obscure reality. Well, what we need the media to give us is the dictionary definition of static. Criticism, opposition, unwanted interference. We need a media that covers power, not covers for power. We need a media that is the fourth estate, not for the state. And we need a media that covers the movements that create static and make history. That, I believe, is the beginning of, well, what supports a democratic society. There's a reason why our profession, journalism, is the only one explicitly protected by the US Constitution, because we are supposed to be the check and balance on power. We're supposed to be that. We're not supposed to be a party to the parties, but we're supposed to be apart from them. So I want to talk about being at the Republican and Democratic conventions. We went there to, well, we expanded Democracy Now! To 2 hours. I should just give you a little history on Democracy Now! I explained Pacifica. In the week of September 11, 2001, we started on our first TV station, a public access station in Manhattan that was linked to the community media center we worked in the garret of an old firehouse. We were blocks from Ground Zero, the closest national broadcast to Ground Zero. And we started that week, and we were emergency programming. And then more and more TV stations asked if they could run us, and I thought it was breaking news, so I felt we couldn't just put it in the mail, so we FedExed it to them. This is before we used satellites, and soon there were scores of stations taking us. And well, now, as we celebrate our 16th year, Democracy Now!, we're on over 1,100 public radio and television stations around the country and around the world, increasingly on NPR and PBS stations. We're very excited. In the last months, we went on WHUT, which is the PBS station based at Howard University in Washington, D.C., and on one of the biggest PBS stations in the country on KQED in California. And I think this is because of the hunger for independent voices. And there is no more important time than now in an election year. So we headed to the conventions, expanded to 2 hours a day, Breaking with Convention, War, Peace, and the Presidency, covering the conventions inside and out. And we're following the basic tenets of good journalism. Follow the money, especially now. In this first post-Citizens United election, that is the story that must be told, but it's very difficult to tell because it's expected more than $2 billion will be spent on these elections, and much of that money is unsourced. We don't know where it is coming from, but some of it we do. And so my colleague and senior Democracy Now! Producer Mike Burke, who's been with us for 10 years, started to roam the halls of the corporate suites with Hani Massoud, our video producer. Now let me tell you a little about Hani. He leaps buildings in a single bound. 2 years ago, a year and a half ago, he was in Egypt covering the Egyptian revolution for us. How many of you heard our coverage of the Egyptian revolution with Sharif Abdel-Qadir, who is a remarkable reporter who still broadcasts from Cairo? Sharif. Sharif, we were at the Sundance Film Festival that year. And it was, January of 2011. We always follow the documentary track. These journalists who spend years investigating stories, and yet they get very little attention because it's all the paparazzi and the celebrities of the other part of Sundance. So we focus on this. It's the 10th anniversary this year. And Sharif started to get texts from his friends and family members at home in Egypt. He comes from a very illustrious family. His grandfather is the most famous writer of Egypt, Hassan Abdel-Qaddous. And he started to get these texts, his relatives saying, "I will die for my country." He's saying, "Wait a second, that's my cousin. He doesn't care about politics. What is he talking about?" And they were coming in fast and furious, and he knew the climate had changed very quickly in Egypt, and he was on the next plane out. He basically landed in Tahrir and didn't leave. And Hani Massoud, our video producer, also Egyptian American, he played on like the equivalent of the Egyptian national basketball team. He is a tall, strong guy. And that was critical for this reporting. First, Mubarak plunged Egypt into digital darkness. Well, he didn't do it by himself. He needed a U.S. company, Naris, based in California, to flip the switch. And when there was so much outcry, how could this U.S. corporation do this? They put out a press release that said we were only following orders. We have heard that before. And Sharif joked, this was Mubarak's fatal error. He said, we're Egyptian after all. We would have been inside on Facebook, on the internet, and then he turns it off so we all have to go outside. So then, but, Democracy Now! From the beginning, we started scrappy. Necessity is the mother of invention. We didn't have the money for satellites to send our shows, and on radio we would put, from the beginning, before the networks were doing this, our MP3s online for other radio stations to take, and of course for individual listeners to listen to. And then when we went on TV, we did the same. We pioneered a way to send broadcast quality video through the internet so that TV stations could take it. But now we're using satellites as well, but we also use the internet. And when Mubarak brought back up the internet, but then the thugs knocked down the satellites, the networks didn't know what to do. Now, Sharif had already worked out a way, during the time the internet was down, to tweet. And he became one of the top tweeters in the world. CNN was citing his tweets. And then when the internet went up and the satellites went down, I remember seeing Anderson Cooper in his hotel room on Skype. He was looking like old Democracy Now! And the lower third said, reporting from an undisclosed location. There was Sharif in the middle of Tahrir, saying, I am right here in Tahrir, the safest place to be in Egypt. And he was being interviewed on MSNBC, on CNN, show after show, day after day, and of course on Democracy Now!, but we call that trickle-up journalism. So, what was it that he brought us that was so remarkable? You met families, you met people, you understood where they were coming from. You met Adef Sawef, the great Egyptian writer who wrote Map of Love, and Dr. Nawal Saadawi. She was 79 years old. She had run for president. She was a psychiatrist. She had written many books. And she had been imprisoned under Sadat. She had been exiled under Mubarak. She'd been holding salons for young people. And as they were so discouraged before the revolution, she was saying, "We will win, we will win." In fact, as the Egyptian revolution unfolded and Mubarak fell, she actually came to the United States. We'd interviewed her for years, and I was very excited to see her again in our new studios at Democracy Now! And then the Japanese tsunami hit. And that was the day that Dr. Nawal Saadawi was going to come in. It was a big day. We had really promoted this. She's such a remarkable woman. But we have to bring out the voices of people of Japan in this time of crisis. So I work with an amazing group of people, and one of the producers had to call Dr. Saadawi and say, "Could you come an hour later? You won't be actually on the show. We've got to deal with this terrible tragedy that's unfolding now in Japan." And she's getting increasingly agitated, and she says, "I don't understand, why are you bumping me?" And so the producer said, "Well, there's been a tsunami in Japan." She said, "My whole life is a tsunami." But anyway, back to Tahrir. So you met Nawal, you met Hadef, you met the young high school student who was putting out a broadsheet called Voices of Tahrir in the shadow of the state media building in Cairo that had spewed lies for so many decades. These were the voices, not just the bird's eye view of this remarkable scene of 1 million people gathered together to reclaim their lives, to reclaim their country, to begin to try to create a democracy in Egypt. But you met them, and that's the power of independent media. It is why we must work for it, why we must challenge the corporate media to bring out the voices of the grassroots, and why we have to build our own media. So Sharif would be interviewing all these people. Hani would race the video back to Sharif's house, and he would edit these beautiful 20-25-minute series walking through Tahrir, and he would send them through the internet where none of the networks were able to get these reports out. That was Hani in 2010, so 2011. 2012, he's walking the corporate suites of the Republican convention with Mike, and Mike spots Sheldon Adelson. You know, he is the casino billionaire magnate, his casinos in Macau as well as Vegas, who started by supporting Newt Gingrich and says he will pour $100 million into this election. Been investigated for bribery and corruption. And so Mike is walking the halls, he's going by Suite 571, and there is Mr. Adelson. And he goes to ask him just how much he's going to spend in this election. But the woman standing behind Mr. Adelson and in front of Mike steps back and body slams Mike. And he doesn't know what's happened. He's knocked off balance. And before Hani knows it, and this is why I give you this background of Hani who's holding his camera, she grabs Hani's camera. He is filming all of this. And she runs into the Adelson suite. Now these suites, you know, they're doors that go into, look like just rooms, but when you walk into them, they are the skyboxes that overlook the convention center, and you'll have, these are where the high rollers are, and they've got their friends. Karl Rove's going in, Newt Gingrich is going into the Adelson suite, and then when you look up at these rows from the convention floor, you see people drinking wine, and they're sort of viewing this spectacle. But Mike doesn't know what is going on. Their camera's been taken. He reaches for his Android phone to start trying to take pictures to document what is happening, and the security and other Adelson team are grabbing his phone. I mean, if nothing else, I thought Sheldon Adelson actually is a proponent of private property. I mean, and here they are stealing it. So Hani puts his foot in the door of Adelson's suite as his camera is going into it, and this woman slams his camera on the ground. And these guys don't know what has happened. And finally, someone comes out of the suite, the top spokesperson for Mr. Adelson. He gives Mike his card, says, "We'll take care of everything. We'll deal with everything. You just call us tomorrow. We'll make you whole." And Mike's saying, "What is going on here? Who is that woman?" He said, "Oh, that would be Mr. Adelson's daughter." So now this got a bit of attention, and the New York Times wrote about it, and Politico, and even on Glenn Beck's website, a whole description of, you know, the Adelson family assaulting the Democracy Now! Team. And so the Amazons realized they had to put out some kind of press release. And they are nothing if not well lawyered up, so it was written very carefully, and it said something to the effect of, we believe journalists should be nonviolent. Now we share that belief. They were very careful not to make any assertion because they knew we had the video. And they knew many people had seen what happened. And then they went on to wish us well in covering the Republican convention. So the next day I went over to try to interview David Koch. David Koch was a delegate with the New York delegation. So let's look at this as the Tampa Convention Center. And New Hampshire's over there, Wisconsin is right here. Utah's back there, and New York is right over there. So I am walking up and down this aisle a lot, and David Koch is a New York delegate. You know, David and Charles Koch are the billionaire oil magnates who have funded the Tea Party movement and are promising to give something like $400 million to spend in this election. And I thought it was important to ask them a question. So I went over with my video producer, and I said, Mr. Adelson, he was sitting with other delegates, I'd like to ask you if you are concerned that unchecked, concentrated wealth will subvert democracy. Immediately, all of the delegates around him stood up like a stand of trees growing in seconds, except for him. He is a towering figure, but he is cowering behind them. And when we went to find video of him for our website, the photograph from the video, the only one we could find is him looking up with one eye. So they continued to stand there to protect him from this question, and the only thing I could do was ask the person next to him, who was Mr. Cox, they're wearing name tags, and it says Edward Cox. And Edward Cox is the longtime chair of the New York Republican Party. He is the son-in-law of the late President Richard Nixon. His wife is Tricia Nixon Cox. And I asked him, are you concerned that unchecked, concentrated wealth will subvert democracy? And he said no. So anyway, I went over and started to interview other people. I saw Abe Lincoln. Did you see this figure on the floor of the Republican convention? I mean, a lot of networks interviewed. He looked more Abe than Abe. He had a big top hat on. And he's actually a Missouri delegate named George Engelbach, but was enjoying the attention. And I went up to him, I said, what's happened to your party, Abe? And so we had an interesting conversation. And he said he was a Missouri delegate, which meant he is Todd Aiken's colleague, and they served together in the state legislature in Missouri. So I asked, what do you think of his comment, the whole idea about if women are victims of legitimate rape, they wouldn't get pregnant because their bodies shut down. I didn't call him Dr. Aiken, I said he was Congressman Aiken. So he said that he really thinks that Congressman Aiken should be forgiven because he misspoke. I actually also don't think you should focus on people who misspeak or what they say, because a lot of people misspeak, and there's so many important issues. Gaffes are not the issue. I just don't think that Aiken misspoke. He is expressing a whole school of thought about legitimate rape, forcible rape. Actually, when we went to Tampa, we heard about this big hurricane that was going to hit. And I was saying, oh my gosh, are they going to cancel the convention? And one of our producers, Steve Martinez, said, is it a legitimate hurricane? And so our general manager, Julie Crosby, said, because if it is, not to worry, Tampa will shut down and it will let no one in. So I said to him, well, you know, what do you think about, you know, that it's not that the Republican Party is so concerned about Todd Aiken. I mean, they are, because they wanted to take the Senate, and that's very much jeopardized now. You had Karl Rove fleeing from and taking his super PAC money from the Aiken race. You know, he is challenging Claire McCaskill for her Senate seat in Missouri. And it looked like before this interview he did with a local reporter, he could possibly win. So the Republicans are desperate to get him out, but he is standing fast. Newt Gingrich just endorsed him. Rick Santorum just endorsed him. But I think why they're so concerned is not so much about Todd Aiken, but it highlights the record of Paul Ryan. They've not just supported legislation together, they've co-sponsored legislation that refers to things like forcible rape. And now when Paul Ryan was asked about this, he said, And when they said, what do you mean by forcible rape? He said, rape is rape. And he's right to say that. But when the spotlight is finally focused in the right direction, there's nothing else you can say. And when asked, well, why do you keep adding that word forcible? He says, it's just boilerplate language. So it's the concern here that, of what exactly Paul Ryan represents. You know, Paul Ryan is a man with a plan. Mitt Romney has been harder to pin down, so it's much easier to seriously look at his record. So when I was speaking to Abe Lincoln and asked him about this word forcible, and he said, well, yes, that is a real issue. He says, I'm concerned about brutal rapes. And I said, well, what isn't a brutal rape? And he said, oh, you know, when a girl or woman's inebriated or high on drugs, or you slip her a Mickey. And I said, my God, I mean, he represents a whole population in Missouri. He is a Missouri delegate. And these are the kinds of conversations we were having for those few days of the Republican convention. Again, I knew that aisle very well. So when the last night came and the mystery guest appeared, Clint Eastwood, came out with the empty chair. We were with New Hampshire interviewing people there. Clint Eastwood appeared, he brought out that chair. And you know, no one quite, especially the Republicans, knew what was going on. And he started referring to President Obama. And the implicit racism in this, you know, the invisible president, the invisible man by Ralph Ellison. Then he moved on to say things like President Obama had promised to close Guantanamo, and yet it has been years. And I think that's a very legitimate criticism. I just didn't expect to hear it on the stage of the Republican convention. He went on to talk about how Obama has presided over the longest war in U.S. history, and something about Mitt Romney would pull out troops the next day. I don't think anyone was more surprised than Mitt Romney to hear what Clint Eastwood had to say. And then Mitt Romney came out, and he made his entrance from the back. And he came down the aisle. We were in New Hampshire, there were thousands of people. We couldn't see him, but we saw him on the Jumbotron, saying, oh my gosh, he's coming down that aisle I know so well. He's passing, you know, I recognize Senator Hatch's sneakers and, you know, Abe Lincoln's hat, and we're going down. I said, oh my gosh, he's going to hit the New York delegation. He's shaking people's hands, greeting people. He's going to shake hands with David Koch, and that's an important symbol to record. So I said to John Hamilton, our videographer, film the Jumbotron. He said, oh, come on. You know, we are reporters, we get a big pool feed at the end of the night, that's what goes to all the reporters, and they'll be able to get that. Let's talk to people in the delegation. I said, film the Jumbotron. Because you never know what you're going to get afterwards. And so sure enough, he comes down, he's shaking people's hands, and it's not surprising when he passes the big pole that says New York, all the delegates are standing, and he stops at David Koch, shakes his hand, puts his arm around him, points at him, and then moves on down. I said, okay, we have that. And at the end of the night, we called Robbie Karen, our producer in New York. We said, pull that image from the pool feed. We'll be using that when we talk about the Romney-Koch connection. And he said, there is no image like that. So I said, what are you talking about? No, we saw it, and I didn't even see it live. I saw it on the Jumbotron, so I know it was videoed, and that's the video, I believe, that goes out to the world. And I said, and Robbie said, no, I don't see that. I said, well, maybe you don't recognize Mr. Koch, because they're very much behind the scenes. He's this towering figure. He's right next to the New York pole. And he said, no, it goes down. I see him shaking everyone's hand, but at that point, it goes to these two young women, very energetic. It cuts away to this other image. They're wearing red and white and blue boa feather scarves, and they're sort of dancing. And then it shows a big scene of the whole convention floor. This is just all a matter of seconds. And then it goes back to him shaking hands in the New York delegation and coming back up the stage. So I said, send it to us. And sure enough, those seconds are not there. So the next day, we did a split screen. We showed the Jumbotron, and as he came down, he stopped and shook Mr. Koch's hand. And again, I actually don't think it's so amazing. He is one of his donors and supporters. I expected this to happen. It's just that no one got to see it. And then we did the split screen where we showed what the rest of the world saw. I called Reuters, where we get our news feed. I said, where'd you get that? And they said, oh, well, you know, every day a different network does the feed. It just so it stops creating chaos. You have one